Today on Conversations Aloud, we are discussing anxiety and sex addiction. We're joined by Patrick Ehlers, who is a clinician and a licensed professional counselor. He is now a life coach, and he's also been a college teacher on numerous subjects related to this. Welcome to the show, Patrick.
Thanks, Hadi. Been looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, me too. So let's start off with, what is anxiety and how is it different to stress?
Yeah, so that when you think about those two words, they often do have a close parallel for sure. I think when I'm looking at it, and I consider it in different ways. I guess I would look at stress is sort of there's kind of two kinds of stress. It seems like, at least in my experience, you kind of have stressors that you can control, right, within your range of control. So those are things that you can do, your routines, your things that you have around your house, your environment, those kind of things, right? There's things that we kind of have within our range of ability to be able to control. And then on the other side of that, we have sort of non-controllable stressors, which is usually where people usually kind of think about those things. They're things that happen in life, right? They're things we can't control. Those are the interactions we have with our people. Those are the events that happen in the world, et cetera. So those are kind of two different ways in that sense that stress kind of exists for folks. But I would kind of look at anxiety more as how am I reacting to the stressors that I have in my life. So anxiety typically looks more like worry. Commonly for people, worry can also turn into a lot of what I call future tripping. So you think a lot about kind of what's the worst case scenario. So a lot of catastrophizing. That's a typical common word we use for that. So looking ahead and kind of thinking worst case scenario creates a lot of those worries, and all those scenarios kind of play out in a person's head, and they tend to sort of be focused on what that looks like for them. So they end up, kind of worrying about what could happen, and so they focus a lot on the future, or sometimes it could be the past. What they have done. There's a lot of shame around that, meaning kind of what I have done has created me, made me feel like I'm being disconnected from my main primary community, so to speak. So I'm going to be, worried if somebody finds out my secrets or something like that. That could also be a worry for them on the air side. And then there's a physical component to anxiety, usually typically because our brains race and think about a lot of those things. Sometimes that can elevate heart rate. Sometimes that can create like a panic attack. So basically your body starts to react in a way that it's like in a fight or flight type of state, thinking that there's going to be something that's going to happen. One of these scenarios might work out. What happens if it does? It's difficult to break out of that. And when you have a lot of that looping of kind of thoughts and what's the worst case scenario, you have a lot of those elevate in that way. So that's typically how I guess I would define anxiety in that way, as far as, people's reactions, or sort of physical, sort of mental, kind of both.
Yes. So, with stress, you mentioned there, you're there's going to be things happening all around us that's going to cause stress, but how you react to that stress can be can cause you to have some anxiety. And
Hmm.
I guess what you're saying is the thinking around that stress that might be either due to related to something you're thinking about the future with respect to that stress trigger, or something from the past, something happened that you associate pain with what's happening around you, is going to cause you to
Hmm.
have that
Yeah.
anxiety, which we usually, I guess, feel in our body a lot of times, that tense, shallow breathing, kind of like something imminent is about to happen. Interesting. Is it always a problem to have that anxiety, because it's very kind of shunned, um, or does it serve as a positive function in certain circumstances?
Well, like any emotions, I mean, there are things that they're useful for, but usually because they've become kind of it starts to have a negative context when it becomes distressing to the point that your life is affected by it, right? So then, and again, that can look different for everybody. There's not one size fits all for that. So a lot of different emotions, particularly you think about anger, gets usually a lot of bad rap, right? Anger is like, I don't want to be angry, and angry is a bad thing, and those kind of things. Similar to the same kind of idea, anxiety, there is an element of anxiety. We need some anxiety. We need some stress in our life to motivate us, to move us forward, to do the things we need to do as humans. Now, there's comes a point where does that become so distressing for a person that they have a hard time functioning? That, and again, that can look different for everybody. For a person A, they may say, hey, my functioning, my mental health is I can't focus on anything else because I'm so concerned about all these possible scenarios working out. That can be distressing for that person. But for person B, maybe those stressors allow them, or those anxieties that they've had allow them to motivate them to become a stronger person. To become a person who's more motivated to become better, and so they kind of overcome that. So I think it's depending on the circumstance and the person. one of the things we've seen, at least it seems like, and this is observational from my experience, is that it seems like because of all the things that have happened in the world over the last, 4 years, there is much more of a greater focus on, all the things that could go wrong. And, when you have a pandemic like we've had, that you kind of focus on, when you have nothing else to really focus on, you're just staying home. That creates a lot of those types of anxiety. So sometimes people, the more that they're active and they're trying to focus on other things in their life, it can kind of drown out that noise a little bit. So that's where I always say, when you're working out or you're doing things to help you, take care of you, good self care, that helps you to be able to overcome some of those things in that area. So not always true for everybody, but I think, yeah, I think like you said, there's certainly this aspect of where do people start to focus so much that becomes a distressing, fact for them to be able to function. That's really kind of the big thing I would think about, is how do they, are they living their sort of best life? Are they living the whole person that they are? Those kind of things. If they're
Yeah,
not, then they're probably, they're struggling with those kind of fears.
and it's interesting because like when I think about when I feel some stress, it helps me focus. Like if I'm
Mhm.
slightly stressed, if I'm too relaxed while I'm working, I'm just like wasting time and it's just chill and
Yeah.
I get distracted. But then when there's a bit of stress, I get, I get shit done basically. But
Mhm.
obviously,
Yep.
to your point, there comes a threshold where when you kind of cross that threshold, it actually impacts it negatively. And that
Yep.
threshold is different for different people. Um, the
And it's
problem,
season to season too, season to season people's lives, so you'll see maybe one person when they're 40, they're able to handle that, but then when they're 50 or 60, they're not, so it just depends on, I think, on seasons of life too.
yeah, yeah, that's a good point. But I feel like we're not preparing the young generation to deal with stress. Because I was looking at the data on this, and it's very interesting. In 2023, this is in the UK, where I'm based, nearly 30% of men and 37% of women reported high levels of anxiety. Now, 10
Hmm.
years ago, 2020, 2013, 2012, the numbers were 18% for men and 22% for women. That's a 65% increase in reporting high
Yeah.
levels of anxiety. Why do you feel there are more people with anxiety today than 10 years ago? You mentioned a couple of things there, like COVID and kind of being in the house. When that happened, anxiety increased. Are there any things that you're seeing that's causing this huge spike compared to 10 years ago?
We have a hard time accepting the things that are going to be part of life, like we talked about, those non-controllable stressors. And there's some things that we're just not going to be able to do anything about, and unfortunately, life has things that are negative that happen to us, right? We can't always have the perfect dream life, so to speak. And I'm not saying that everybody has that perspective, but I think there is an expectation, at least in, so we're the United States. So kind of our expectation is that, hey, you're going to do this and you're going to do this and you're going to do this. And then you have a bunch of people who are kind of fighting that whole model, so to speak. But it seems like that there's definitely a focus on accepting, there's things we can't control, and what can we control, working on those things. And so the anxieties are around a lot of these things that people can't do anything about. It's just part of being human. And I think that the less we accept, the more likely we're going to probably feel more anxious, because it's going to feel like, why can't I fix this? Or why can't I change this relationship? Or why can't I find this person? Or why can't I, endless amount of questions, it just kind of keeps going down that loop of, it's never going to stop kind of thing. So there certainly is an aspect of it where how much are we willing to accept, and how much are we willing to be okay with the things in life that are going to suck, because there's going to be things that are going to be like that. We can't have the perfect dream life in our scenario. Sometimes it's going to look differently than what we envision in our mind. And that goes back to some ideas, about fantasy, and even it doesn't have to be sexual fantasy, but certainly the fantasy that we play out in our own mind. What are our expectations, and what do we sort of project, so to speak, in our own mind, future tripping in that sense, in a positive way. So looking at it from a perspective of, all these things are going to happen if I just do these things. Well, sometimes that works out, and sometimes it doesn't. There's a lot of things that, are roadblocks to those particular dreams. Not saying people can't be successful, but saying that people, the life that you think about in your own mind, your fantasy, may not be the life that plays out in your reality, I guess, is a good way of putting it.
And that's I think a very important point because it feels like to me when I think about also my anxiety that I used to have a lot of, a couple of years back, it used to be connected to this idea of what a perfect life is and me trying to match that exactly. Perfect life in my relationship, perfect life in kind of my career, perfect life in all those different things. which
Hmm.
weren't actually even from me. It was kind of like from my environment of what a perfect life
Yeah,
is.
culture, society. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and there has to be a balance between kind of learning to experience life and enjoy the different experiences, because your idea of what your idea that this is going to lead to a great thing may not lead to a great thing, even though you think that is perfect, because you just don't know what that's going to bring about. But at
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
same time, you need to balance that with actually still pushing yourself and kind of maximizing your potential and working hard to see how you can bring out your full potential out to the world. It's
Hmm.
kind of a difficult balance sometimes to do, to kind of push hard but also learn to enjoy the different breadth of experiences that you can have that
Right.
are not just connected to one idea of what perfect is.
Mhm.
Right.
Well, and you had a lot of great things there for sure. Like, certainly how do we define great? How do we define perfect? How do we define, success? Those kind of things in our life. But I think one of the things I guess I heard you say there is that, the idea that there's certainly being okay and being in the moment, being grounded in today is really important in fighting and combating anxiety. Because a lot of anxiety is based upon things either that haven't happened or based on the things that are in my own mind, what could happen that haven't happened. So it's all based on some future tripping idea, right? There, I'm thinking about something that hasn't quite, been seen. Something hasn't come into fruition yet.
Yeah.
Where if I'm living in the moment, like you said, you got to embrace some of those things, the things that are good, the things that are bad, the things that are challenging, the challenges, the things that are going to make me persevere. I mean, that's just being human. So I think there is an aspect of that anxiety, and that's easier said than done. But certainly, learning that, when I go back to where I use maybe the word vision in that sense, is that it's like kind of like a cable car. You have one point where the cable car is attached in your life. Usually that case is like maybe my hardest moment or my deepest area that I've struggled in, all the way to kind of where my vision is. And so my vision has to be things that are very tangible. They have to be things that I can close my eyes and say, yeah, I can see myself doing these things. Now, I can close my eyes and say that I'm going to, drink coffee on, 10 years from now on this date or whatever. Like, that's fine. I can make it that specific, but it may not look like that when I actually get there. But it's part of that driving. That's like the cable car is kind of pulling me along that track to get me to where I need to go. So I think that's another way of thinking about that, is that, do I have a vision for myself, and do I kind of know that my vision is within the realm of reality, but it's also based in kind of what who I see myself as, how I identify myself as, having that sort of anchor in the future, knowing that it may not look exactly like I envisioned it, but that helps me to motivate myself to get there, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I guess it requires a bit of knowing yourself and what you seek to create, which can be difficult by itself to do.
Hmm. A
Um,
lot of self insight there. You have to know, yeah, self awareness.
yeah, 100%. Um, you mentioned there are a couple things of how to kind of manage your anxiety. What other things are there for someone who is feeling that anxiety? What can they do to work around it?
Well, like we were just talking about, I think there's a lot of grounding that is really important. So a couple of different grounding techniques that I know have worked. I know folks like to usually
And just for
focus
people
on
who don't know
is.
what grounding is, what does that mean?
So grounding is a tool that we use for people for mental health to try to help them stay more present. So you're focused on kind of like where you're at right here, right now. Like I said, you're not looking at kind of the future, you're not looking at necessarily the past. You're kind of being present in the moment. And so you can use a lot of grounding tools with a lot, usually within the realm of your five senses. So again, five things you see in the room, four things that you can touch in the room. What's the textures? Three things that you can hear, two things that you could smell, one thing you could taste. And you can, if you want to mix those up, you can. I usually try to keep them, stable in that sense, because it's a lot easier for people to remember those if they want to use that in the moment. So
And
that's one tool.
just on that, I know you kind of also did describe this, but why? Because we hear a lot about being present, be present, be present.
Right.
Why is that important?
Well, because if you're being present, you are not focusing so much on, again, back in your mind, where your mind is taking you down something that isn't either happening or something that could happen. You're kind of looking through the possibilities of things.
Yeah, and it goes back to the point, which is I think some people make, which is what you're reacting to most of the time is just your thoughts, right? That's the thing that
Yeah.
you are essentially reacting to. And so when
Right. That's
you're,
your stimulus, so to speak.
yeah, yeah, and so like to your point, when you're kind of present, you are. now kind of more focused on the experience of what's happening and kind of grasping
Yep.
everything, as opposed to just the thoughts that keep on coming and you're
Mhm.
just reacting to them constantly without, like, uncontrollably, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think with that too, it also allows you to be close to the people that are around you. You know, the more you focus on the things that they're not happening, the more likely you're going to be not present with the people around you. You're going to be absent. You're going to be, you know, doing something that doesn't involve you kind of interacting with those who are closest to you. You know, whether that be your partner, whether that be your family, whoever that is, your friends. You know, you're not really interacting in relationships. You're sort of being kind of in your own space. So you're kind of turning into yourself almost in some ways and kind of closing everybody else off. So that's why grounding is really, I think, from that perspective, is important. Keeps you more present. Another really good one that we use is what they call box breathing. So you think about basically a square, and if the you go across the square, you're breathing in, and as you go down, it holds. Then you breathe out as you go back along the bottom, and then you hold again, going back up. So that's another really basic tool that you can use, pretty much today,
So you're
as
you're
kind of a
you're
way to
breathing
be
in
focused.
for 2 seconds. Is it 2 seconds? You said
I think it's 4 seconds on the
4 seconds.
couple I've seen. There's a couple different ones, but yeah. So you're when you think about the box, you start on one corner and go across, and that's like 4 seconds of breathing in. When you get to the end of that first line, you go down, you hold
You
for
hold
four
your four,
seconds.
4 seconds. Yeah,
Yeah, and then as you go back across on the bottom of the box, you would breathe out, and then
for
you
four
hold again,
seconds.
going back up for
Yeah,
4 seconds. Yeah.
yeah, and then you go back. Okay.
Yep.
And what does that do?
Well, a lot of the deep breathing work resets your body to homeostasis, which is basically just a fancy term for, everybody has a version of it in our own body. We all have an ideal place, ideal heart rate, ideal sort of blood pressure, etc. So it's physically kind of resets your body a little bit when you do deep breathing. So it allows you to, number one, allows you to get a control of your thoughts, because your thoughts, no, they're not probably looping as much when you're breathing and you're focusing on breathing. It also allows your body to start to calm down and go back to kind of like a baseline. And the reason that's important is because when you have anxiety, typically your body reacts to it, right? So the more your thoughts loop, the more likely your heart's going to start racing. You're going to start getting into kind of panic mode, fight or
One
flight,
feeds
those
the
kind of
other, right?
responses. Yep. Yeah. So the thoughts interact with your body in that sense. So when that happens, typically it'll elevate like that for folks. And then when that elevates, it just gets overwhelming. And so a panic attack is, when it's like you can't really shut those off, right? They just kind of keep going, looping, looping, looping.
Yeah. So
So that's
so
kind
basically,
of way I would
there's,
say
I
to
guess,
describe
two
that.
two two angles to that, right? There's things you could do to calm your body if you're having anxiety, which
Mhm.
you said that the box breathing is an example, and which will calm
Yep.
yourself, because when you calm your body, you're calming your mind also at the same time. And then the other element is
Refocusing.
actually dealing with the thoughts that are
Mhm.
happening. Kind of, I
Yep.
guess sometimes it's just actually recognizing that you are reacting to those thoughts. Because sometimes I remember when I was feeling a lot of anxiety, it was, you're not even aware that you're reacting to those thoughts. You're kind of like, it's like
Mhm.
you're running on a treadmill, and you're just not realizing that you're running on a treadmill, and then you're like, shit, hang on, wait a minute, these are just thoughts that I'm just reacting to. Let me just
Mhm.
actually
Yep.
challenge that piece. So when you combine those two together, that works really, really well.
Yeah, the other thing too, and you've kind of mentioned it, is this, and I've talked about too, this idea of the looping. And so what I found is that it seems like that not only anxiety, but also, we talk about fantasy, tends to loop a lot. And so it tends to, I think about it as, it's like a train track, right? And it's kind of going around and around. You got to put a little bit of a bend in the track. And so part of that idea is to create lists in your mind to kind of redirect yourself to a different place. So one of the things I use, because we're in the United States, a lot, the area, right? A lot of people like football. So American football, all of the divisions of the teams are in fours. So I always encourage, especially when working with guys, I'm always like, think about the four division, each team there's 32 teams. So you can go through all list of those, thinking about each team in the division, and that redirects your mind away from the looping of all the catastrophizing and what's the worst case scenario and stuff like that. So that's another way I've used that too, is to help people just create, again, and you can tailor it to you. That's what I like about it, is you can make it, if you like cars, top 10 list of cars. If it's your favorite music, make it about your music. If you like art, there's, all the different ways you can tailor that to you. And then that makes it much more personal. If I give you a tool that has nothing to do with you personally, you're not going to want to do it. So I think it's important to find those things that kind of work for you specifically and how to modify those.
Yeah, taking control of the narrative. Um, Awesome. What does the general public get wrong about anxiety?
Well, I think like you said at the beginning, kind of what's considered distressing. This seems true for a lot of mental health across the board. We kind of look at it as, this person's not, now at least the attitude in the United States seems to be is, okay, this person's either strong enough to not need help, or this person is weak enough that they need help. That's kind of sort of the narrative. It seems like there's two camps there, and neither of those things are true necessarily. I mean, I think there is some level of strength to a person who has self-awareness, but how do you learn the self-awareness? If you don't learn those tools, if you don't take time to learn those things, how can you understand yourself better? So seeking help is not a place of weakness. It's a place of learning and understanding, and that takes a lot of courage, and there's a lot of strength in that. So I think one of the big areas anxiety gets kind of wrapped up in there is that it's just becoming sort of the norm that people should just experience that. Well, that doesn't I mean, that might be true, but at the other side of that is that, how do I, if I'm not living my ability to be my full potential, I like how you said that earlier. If I don't live to my full potential, and if I'm not able to give as much of myself to other folks and enhance the people around me, enhance the life around me, then what kind of life am I living if I'm just going to say, okay, well, I'm just going to take a step back and just be anxious and not go out and not do these things because I'm struggling with something that really is a legitimate part of being human. I would say it's also similarly along the line, same with depression. Depression is kind of almost like expected, like, oh, that's just what somebody deals with. That's how it is. Now, I think that helps the stigma piece of it, because people are willing to get help, which is a good thing. But on the other side of it, then it's kind of like, because it's accepted, no one will seek treatment. So that's kind of one of the things I think, or seek assistance, I guess would be another way of putting that. So I think that seems to be a pretty big thing that's happening, is that there's a sort of an acceptance piece of it, which I think, like I said, is good. But on the other side of it, um, I think when you have acceptance, you also have a lot of, it normalizes it a lot, and then people don't have a desire necessarily to go and seek, how to improve or to get better.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think there is a lot of courage to actually admit the experience that you're having, and work through it. Because when you work through it, you know what you're saying is that you
Mm,
will increase your awareness about what who you are, and kind of the thresholds that you have, but also you're kind of moving the threshold of how much you can
yep.
manage, which I think is extremely important if you are going to push uh, yourself, and kind of see what what potential you hold. The other side of it is, I feel like we've I don't want to say normalized it, but for the younger generation, we've said, I feel a lot of times is that you have anxiety, there is something wrong with you, and it's more of like a disability,
Okay.
which is
Hmm.
putting people in a box, and they've taken that as part of their identity, that I'm a person that has anxiety, and so I'm unable to do X, Y, and Z.
Hmm.
Um,
Yep.
do you see that?
I guess I would say the world in my world, where anxiety sort of has been, at least in the last 4 years, has been that it's been more about escaping it. Trying to find ways to get away from it. And so a lot of people do that through addiction. A lot of people do that through other types of unhealthy behavior, because anxiety is so kind of like in their face. The way I describe it is like, it's the colors are too bright. If you think about, if you're in a dark room and you turn a light on, if you're getting up from, sleeping or whatever, you turn the light on, all of a sudden it's really bright and you kind of have to shield your eyes until your eyes adjust. That's a little bit like what people sometimes experience. Like, there's like too much color in the room. And so they have to kind of try to numb out. And so anxiety is one of those ones that they tend to numb out from, not necessarily escape it, but they try to numb from it. And they just try to kind of tune down the lights a little bit, in that sense. So that's usually more where I see, at least in the more recent realm, where it is. But I would agree with you in the sense that, yeah, people, I think, can feel like anxiety is debilitating, and when they've kind of accepted that as their identity, or they've accepted that as who they are, then yes, then it does shackle them to wherever they feel safe. And again, that could be a lot of different places. That could be their own home. That could be, mom and dad's home. That could be work. Wherever they feel most safe is probably the place they're going to go to, because they don't feel safe outside of that. So I do think it does play a role in that sense, for sure.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Moving to sex addiction. How can someone tell if they have a sex addiction?
So it is on the rise, and I guess some indicators of sex addiction would be, I guess, first off, it would be really what's in your thought life. Where are you focusing your mind? Do you spend a lot of time preoccupying about other people sexually, to the degree that you really have a hard time concentrating on everything else? Just like we were talking about with anxiety, right? So if you spend a lot of time focusing on living a fantasy life, preoccupying or seeing people in public, or lusting after people in public, those kind of things, those are usually a pretty good indicator in your thought life that you probably are struggling with some of those thoughts. Again, continual behavior that you've said, hey, you want to stop, whether or not it's affairs, whether or not it's pornography, whether or not it's chat rooms, whatever it might be, those are behaviors I've kind of sworn off, and I just keep kind of coming back to them. Um, Coming from a family that has a very rigid background with regarding sexual discussion, sexual history, those kind of things, that's another big one. So families who don't talk a lot about those topics typically see a lot of taboo type around that idea, and then therefore the person who struggles with the addiction typically has a little more curiosity about those things, and so they may seek out sort of this, to discover more about it at a younger age, and then they kind of get hooked. So a lot of these, at least in the United States, anyway, we see a lot of folks starting with sex addiction around between like 8 and 10 years old. Like that's how early it can start as far as the
Just on
seeking
that, actually, that's
pornography.
interesting. Do you think that expose more like too much exposure, or kind of like no exposure at all results in more sex addiction?
Well, it seems like one of the traits we'd look for would be if you had very little, like if you didn't have a lot of conversations around that with your family. Like if your parents really didn't talk to you much about why it was important, why it's important to maintain healthy sex, or what a healthy sex is, then you're probably more likely to have something that can come up from that. That doesn't mean that's true for everybody, but that certainly means that there's more likely that that's probably the
Mm.
case. It seems like another area that also I see a lot of that comes up is that, when it comes to pornography, it's kind of the ongoing hidden part of it, right? It's the inability to sort of be able to connect with people, and the more you isolate, the more shame you have. Going back to anxiety, we talked about, the more anxiety you have about those things, you're using sex as a way to feel better. So usually the two ways that people typically will experience that is either, like we said, escapism or numbing. And so when you're experiencing that, you're kind of isolated to yourself. And the only way, or one of the main ways that people usually heal from these things, is to have a community of people they're connected with, to start to open up about what's going on, to normalize the focus of, hey, like this is something that we struggle with, kind of thing. The more you're isolated, the more likely you're going to have chances to act out. More opportunities are going to be there. One of the things about the internet that's really changed it is that the opportunities are everywhere. um, just a basic boundary change of not taking your phone to the bathroom, the bedroom, can make a huge difference because you're not having as many opportunities.
That-
That's what I
that-
find with the
That's
internet.
that's the interesting thing, because you know, uh, 10 years ago, you couldn't isolate yourself that much, because if you wanted to buy
The same way.
anything, if you wanted to speak to anyone, you kind of really have to leave the house and kind of interact with other human beings. But now, you could do everything without seeing one face,
Yep.
just through the internet, laptop, your phone. And so I guess people are feeling more lonely, and that there's a whole world out there that can give you some relief from feeling
Hmm.
lonely, or
Yep.
kind of that desire, and it's at your fingertip.
Yeah, and one of the things that a lot of people have talked about that I've worked with who have lived kind of pre-internet, post-internet, is that when you were before the internet, you had to go to 7-Eleven, you had to get a magazine, you had to go home. There were a lot of things that could stop you, or you could redirect
Yeah.
before you got there. The phone allows you to get 2 clicks, you're there. I mean, that's all. I mean, that's how far you are away from a relapse. So, I mean, I think,
Yeah.
and that's true for all of us, but I think that the reality of it is that that's really where it's different. And so how do you, and a lot of times when very early on, people will say, like, well, I just want to, I just don't want to deal with these things. I want to stop these triggers or whatever. And it's like, well, that's a great idea. And I appreciate that people have that sort of sentiment. But the problem is that you live in a world where all this stuff is around. So you have to learn how to navigate what's
Yeah.
what's
It's
what's around you.
it's it's,
There's no
it's
way to make it go away.
Yeah, it's a good point, actually, because I never thought about it like that. Whereby, like, alcohol addiction, you actually have to go out there and you have to pay money to buy
Hmm.
something,
Yep.
which is like most addictions, really. But with porn addiction, it's free, and it's
Free.
and
Yep.
it's like in a few seconds you're there. which
Mhm.
is
Yeah.
actually must make it one of the more difficult addictions to overcome.
Well, I think it's about, like we were talking about earlier, kind of backtracking to where does your desire to act out come from? And acting out is just a term we use for, engaging in this behavior. So, I would say, going back to like the idea of numbing or escape. Let's say that you have a fight with your partner. The temptation to act out goes up way more because you're feeling a certain way, right? You're feeling angry, you're feeling scared, you're feeling like you were unheard. You want to seek some way to feel better. Well, if you've trained yourself when you were single, or maybe before you were in a relationship, that's the way to navigate some of those things. Eventually, because sex is very powerful, and the brain likes to do the same thing over and over again. It creates like little freeways in itself to say, okay, this is how we're going to navigate when this particular thing comes up. That's why it becomes very compulsive, and so people just kind of automatically think about it, automatically do it. So similarly to like we're talking about earlier with anxiety, I just sort of feel it, right? And then this is how I'm going to respond to it. So some of it's breaking a little bit of that. It's also self awareness of understanding, hey, like where am I more likely to be in danger than other places? So like one of the things that comes up a lot, people will talk about going to the grocery store and seeing, somebody that they're attracted to in the store. Okay, well, make sure that you're aware of where they're at, and make sure you're not keeping your eyes on them, and make sure that you're not going down the same aisle and following them around, kind of thing. Like those are some of the, kind of basics in that sense of just being aware of your environment, of where you're at, making sure you're, thought breaking stuff we were talking about earlier, redirecting your mind, going through your NFL teams, all that kind of stuff, so that you're focusing on, what you need to do, and not allowing your mind to kind of take you down fantasy, because that if it takes you down fantasy, just like anxiety, it will loop. And you may not act out with necessarily that person or do something unhealthy with that person, but does that then motivate you later on when you go home? Well, I'm just going to be looking online, all of a sudden I find myself at a porn site that was similar to this person that maybe I had saw earlier in public. So it's some things like that. You have to be, again, self-awareness. And it's also, being aware of opportunity, like we said, if you're at home alone, much more opportunity if you go take the phone to the bathroom or the bedroom than it would be if you, leave your phone out in like a public space, kind of thing. So there's some things that take a lot of just, again, self-reflection and kind of knowing you in that way.
Mm. So do you see sex addiction as a biological drive, psychological, or kind of like a more social phenomenon kind of thing, or is it just all combined depending on the situation?
I would go to the idea that it really feels like it's a lot of emotional. It's an emotional start point that eventually becomes, again, sort of you biologically train, right? So like, and this is true just as human beings, right? We have a lot of, we reinforce ourselves with a lot of different things. So if we are in a position where, I feel one way and this is how I handle it. Let's just use sadness. I'm sad, and then I want to go eat and snack because snacking makes me feel better. Right? The biological drive is I need to eat. Makes sense. But the emotional drive is that I need to feel better there. So I kind of have this sort of pairing over a period of time. And eventually that will become kind of the way I navigate that. So people, they talk about, you go on a date and it doesn't go well and you get your Ben and Jerry's. It's the kind of same thing. It's like I feel sad, so therefore I'm gonna have this particular food's gonna make me feel better. Sex addiction seems to have a lot of those same type of similarities, in the sense that, I had a bad day at school. I feel like I was, bullied or whatever. It's easier for me to come home and kind of look at porn and feel better, masturbate, and then I can go forward from there. I feel scared, so I want to escape that fear. So I'm gonna try to, I'm gonna look at porn that's gonna make me fantasize about something that's different than where I'm at.
So
So
it's
it
like,
does seem like there's a lot of pairing there.
yeah, so it's like a self-defense mechanism that relieves the pain, but also rewires your brain in a way that you start to do that automatically more and more, and becomes
Mhm.
just the
Yep.
easier path to take to relieve that pain.
Yeah, and I'd say again, that's not true for everybody's scenario. Sometimes there are people who have stories of, sexual abuse or have gone through something really traumatic in that way, and so the trauma actually ends up causing them. That's the wound, right? So sometimes it is, and that's not to minimize it, because trauma can look a lot of different ways, but more emotional trauma based stuff would be kind of like, like we said, a divorce, some kind of abandonment, some type of
Mhm.
thing on the kind of one side of that spectrum, and the other side could be life threatening type stuff. So I think sex addiction, like you said, is an easier way for people to be able to navigate that wound. And so they try to use that as a way to kind of channel that and go kind of down this path that's a, very biological. We're all sexual beings, but they use it in a way that's self-gratifying. So I always think about unhealthy sexuality as typically focusing on myself, where healthy sexuality is kind of turning out into the relationship. If it's relationship building, then it's more of what sex is designed to do. It's designed to bring me closer with my partner. Whereas if I'm self-indulging, then it's probably more about me and probably more in the sense of unhealthy, because it's going to drive me more to myself, right? I'm basically having sex with myself. I'm isolating and I'm pulling away from other people.
That's a good way to think about it. Okay. Um, what does sex addiction treatment look like?
There's not a lot of necessarily what I would call mainstream type stuff out there. There are 12-step programs very similar to like AA or like NA. So the typical ones are usually Sexaholics Anonymous, and so SA. There's one called SAA, and then there's another one called SLAA. So Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous is another one, and those are all available. Like I know SA has a website. You can join a group worldwide. They're everywhere. And those are fellowships. There people kind of come together and have a community, and they talk about what their experience has been and those kind of things. So those are important. There's more a faith-based one called Celebrate Recovery that kind of covers a lot of different areas of addiction, but that's another one. For us, for where I've been or where I've been at the last 4 years, our particular practice specializes in not only sex addiction but also partner betrayal trauma, which is part of the side of the partner's experience after they've been betrayed through some type of either a affair or pornography or whatever. And our particular program we use is from a guy named Dr. Patrick Carnes, and he's kind of the guy as far as addiction research goes with sex addiction. He was his research started in the 1980s. He put together an inpatient program that allows it's like a 30-step model. So basically, if you have 12-step program, our program is 30 steps. So it's much more in depth than a 12-step program. So because of that, and because of the length of it, because we're doing it like in an outpatient setting, which means people come in weekly rather than kind of go into like a facility. Um, it's 3 to 5 years long for our program. Now, again, not everybody out there is going to go into a program like ours. They may only need to work with a specialist that works with sex addiction. So those folks would be called a CSAT, Certified Sexual Addiction Therapists, and those are folks that are especially trained in working with individuals who are struggling with some type of sex addiction or sexual compulsive behavior. Again, that's you don't have to work with a CSAT and be in a recovery program. It's usually encouraged, but it's not something you have to do. So those would be some things that are out there. There are a lot of other great therapists out there who work. They might not know as much about sex addiction as a CSAT might, but there's a lot of our therapists who can help with some of your reasons of why you might be acting out. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're an addict. It might mean that that's your unhealthy coping skill, and you tend to go to that more often than not. And because of that, you just got to find some other ways to kind of cope with that, and find those ways we talked about earlier that might be causing some of those things. So those are some treatments that are available, and I think it's on the rise. So that because it's on a rise, there's more and more available for people all over the world.
Yeah, okay. So it's kind of a combination of changing the mechanism through kind of training yourself. I guess working on maybe trauma events, if that's relevant for the person. And I
Could
guess
be
what's really important, I would imagine, is kind of learning how to manage your emotions be- better.
part of it, yeah. Yeah, part of it's emotional management or affect regulation would be probably that'd be like the technical therapist term for it. But another area that comes up a lot is eroticized rage, which is kind of a pairing of anger and sexuality, meaning that when I get angry or when I have feelings of anger, I may do something or try to do something sexually to try to resolve some of those things. So there's an area like that. A lot of folks who struggle with sex addiction typically struggle with what they call an intimacy disorder, meaning that they struggle with the ability to be close to somebody. They have a really hard time, sort of bringing their fence down, so to speak, in their yard so that people can see who they really are. So they try to image management a lot. They try to image manage and they make it look like they're somebody they're not.
Mm.
Maybe not to the degree that's like, they have a completely false persona, but they have, the things that are closest to them, they don't want to let go. So because of that, they tend to sort of feel like they're isolated from people because they're the only person that's experiencing whatever that is. And usually, in most cases, when those folks start to get around are people who are experiencing some of the things they have. it starts to open those doors of, hey, there's other people that are experiencing stuff that we all are as human beings. So I think that's another area. Intimacy is a big part of it, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's just intimacy with women. It could be intimacy with with other family members. And I say that like not sexually. I mean just like emotional intimacy with people.
Mm.
So there's a lot of times where a person who may struggle with sex addiction because of the shame may feel like they're the only person that's ever dealt with this. And I can say this for 100% certainty that they're not the only person that's ever felt that way. So, and that's one of the things I think about all therapy, no matter if it's anxiety or if it's sex addiction or whatever. There's a lot, we all as human beings are all experiencing a lot of the same type of things. And so we are a lot more closer than we are further apart, I think, in that sense. So,
Yeah, and I think that's a big thing. The realization that you're not alone in this, and that other
yep,
people are experiencing maybe not exactly the same thing, but very similar things. It
absolutely.
opens the door to getting help, and accepting that things can change.
Mhm.
So if someone was kind of listening to this, and they know that, or they likely think that they have some kind of sex addiction, what is kind of the advice that you would give them?
Well, the first thing, if you feel like you're struggling with some type of sex addiction, I mean, definitely encourage, wherever you might be, if you're United States, if you're in the UK or wherever in the world you may be listening, to try to seek out and see if there's any services available. One of the websites you can go to is what they call ITAP. It's iitap.com, I believe. And so there's some resources there for folks of our therapists who are certified sex addiction therapists. So there's a database. Another great tool, and I don't know if they have this in the UK, but I know they do in the US, is what they call Psychology Today. It's a website that's just associated with a magazine. And Psychology Today, you can go on there, you can click and look for other therapists and people who work with specific things. So they have different filters. You can filter down to very specifics with insurance. You can filter down to availability, specialty, those kind of things. So that's another really good resource. I think if you're also kind of on the fence of what that looks like, I mean, I think there's a couple different areas you could do. You could check out, like I said, the SA, the Sexaholics Anonymous type group, just to kind of see, kind of what they say, what their other people sharing their stories, if you're willing to do that. So that's definitely a good resource to kind of get into the world of, am I really experiencing some things that our people are experiencing, like we were just talking about. I think the other thing as well is, just being aware of if you're noticing this affecting your life, affecting your relationship, to seek some type of help, or at least get an idea if you are struggling with this particular behavior. Because again, there's a lot of different things that out there that can create some of these behaviors, and I say that because it doesn't necessarily mean that you're an addict. It just might mean that, like I said before, you might have an unhealthy coping mechanism. So I don't like to jump too fast that everybody's an addict, because I think that there's a lot of different circumstances that lead people to different behaviors. And so we want to try to encourage people to at least seek information. So that's definitely a big place to sort of start doing that in that realm, because it is tough. It's a lot of courage to step in and wanting to step in to do the help and to look for that and to do self reflection, especially if you've been hurt. And we all have hurt to some degree, but there's certain wounds that are much harder to unbandage than others, and so that's certainly a place where encourage people to start exploring that and to step into that for themselves in that sense.
Yes, yes. Do you think we're kind of creating more of a culture where sex addiction is more common because of the rise of like OnlyFans and Tinder and other platforms that maybe blurring the line between relationships and kind of consumption?
Absolutely. There's certainly a movement where it seems like that, there's an empowerment in pornography. And so because we've empowered that, not that, I can understand to some degree
So what
why
do you mean
people
by
might
that?
feel that
Empowerment
fantasy
in
is empowering.
pornography?
Well, like with OnlyFans, so like you've made it so that now that everybody can be a porn star.
Mm,
I mean, is
yeah.
that something
Mm.
is that a positive thing for everyone, not just for females, not just for males across the board? Is that a power? Is that a good thing for everybody?
Yeah.
I would probably argue that it isn't, because you're stepping into a space where, yes, there's a lot of financial gain from that, absolutely, but with the financial gain comes, what are you losing, and they don't talk about that, right? There's not a conversation around what are you losing for what you're gaining in other areas. And so I think, from a perspective of sex addiction, I mean, I think we're setting ourselves up to say, okay, well, if we normalize these behaviors, then how can we think that any of these behaviors are sort of dangerous to us? That they become distressing or they become basically dysfunctional because we've celebrated some of these other areas. So I think that certainly the rise of that is a big part of it. You talked about earlier pornography being available basically anywhere, just as much as a Google search is. So it's something where there's that. There's if the more we inundate those images and the more things that we all become numb to those things, right? So is that something we really want? I know, like in some of the sex addiction world, they're moving into like robots,
Mm.
people who aren't even
Yeah.
real, AI, all those kind of stuff. So we're kind of on the cusp of an interesting time because it's going to change in another 10 years. We've kind of used 10 years as kind of our standard today, but in the next 10 years, what's that going to look like? I mean, I
I
don't
think that's
know.
going to push people more towards loneliness, because if you can
Sure.
just get
Mhm.
everything from electronics, you're not you don't just don't need people. But I guess over time, that's going to really negatively impact how you think about yourself and your emotions, and so it's a slippery slope that we don't know where this is going to lead to, really.
Right. And I always think about the idea that we've never had a full generation from birth till death experience the internet. So we really
Mm,
don't know yet what the outcome of even that's going to look like. Just people who've had partially lived with the internet. I mean, I'm at an age where I lived pre-internet and post-internet, but there's some folks who've they've been born in this age, so they already that's all they're going to know is they've lived with that experience. So I think there's a lot of things that we're on the cusp of. I mean, you mentioned the idea of emotions and how it's going to change. I would argue that some of these other things we talked about at the beginning of the program, kind of about anxiety and those things. I think those things are going to continue to increase because the more we use ways to escape them, the more that people are going to feel them, or maybe not going to feel them in the moment, but they're going to be more expressed when they go out into public and they go out into spaces. If they don't feel confident being able to talk to somebody because they spend their intimacy is with their device. I think about relationships with all of our devices. I mean, we have more intimacy with our phone than we have with our partners. We have more intimacy with, our computers than we have with the people around us. And so those are all constant. What's the consequence of those? We don't quite know all of those consequences yet. We've only kind of scratched the surface.
yeah, yeah. Um, I guess lastly, what does the kind of general public get wrong about sex addiction?
Yeah, that's a. I mean, I think there's a lot. Um, there's probably the two big ones I can think of are number one would be that people I think feel like sex addiction isn't real. And that's even within the realm of therapists. There's a lot of therapists who don't think it exists. Um, I'd argue that I think anything can become addictive, but I mean, like if you feel like video games can become addictive, then pornography certainly can become addictive. Sex
Mm,
addiction can be certainly addictive. It all goes back to like we talked about earlier, the idea of do I compare emotions with sort of my biological responses? And that could be for a lot of things, and so there is a lot of around that. So there certainly is a belief I think in public that sex addiction isn't real. So I would say that's the first one. The second one I think is that at least in the United States anyway, there's a high association that sex addiction is going to have something to do with pedophilia, and and again I say that because it feels like it's more of like a loss of control. Like if you have a sex addiction, you can't control your
mm,
behavior toward anybody, and it's like that's not true. For most people, there's a very specific reason why they struggle with whatever their unhealthy sexual behavior is. And in my experience, I don't have a lot of people who've navigated pedophilia. I don't have that's we don't really we typically don't work with people who are sex offenders anyway, but in general that's not something that's a very common part for sex addiction. Like it's not something that comes up. So there's a different area there, but I think the public feels like that it absolutely is. And so there's a part of the stigma of saying I have a sex addiction or struggling with that or going to like an SA group is because people are going to feel like it's something to do with pedophilia, and that's just there hasn't been a lot of evidence to prove that's true.
mm. Interesting, Patrick. That's Thank you for that. That's been very interesting, and from everything you shared. If someone wants to reach out to you, or maybe get some help or work with you, where can they do that?
Absolutely. So the practice I'm currently at will be there for another month or so. The practice is North Point Professional Counseling. It's in Novi, Michigan. The website is northpoint-counseling.com. So we work specifically. I said partner betrayal trauma, sex addiction. That's kind of our specialty there. I'm actually transitioning to my own life coach, support coach kind of role. So I'm gonna be starting that here at the new year. That name is Bloomworks Concepts and Coaching. And so you can reach me. Our email is bloomworkscc@gmx.com. We do have a LinkedIn page. Haven't quite got a website up yet, but that's the next thing we're working on.
Awesome. And we'll put the details in the description. Patrick, thank you so much for your time and for everything that you shared. It was great to have you going.
Well, I appreciate it. I had a really good time sharing, and thanks very much for having me on.
Perfect. Cheers.